This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you every 2 weeks by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello, we're back talking about dogs today, and I'm here with Dr. Angus Nurse, co-author of a report entitled An Investigation of Measures to Reduce Dog Attacks and Promote Responsible Ownership Among Dog Owners with Dog Control Issues in the UK. Dr. Angus Nurse is now Head of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Nottingham Trent University and a researcher in green criminology and human rights. He is a member of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee and a co-chair of A-Law's own Wildlife Law Working Group. And I'm very pleased to be talking to him today about the report and its implications for law and public policy approaches to reducing the incidence of dog attacks. Hello, Angus, and welcome to this episode of Talking Animal Law.
Hi, Paula. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much for joining us today to talk about this report. So this was a government commission report and it was an independent report carried out by yourself and colleagues at Middlesex University, and you've now moved on to Nottingham Trent University, I think.
Yeah, that's right. We started the project a little while ago, and like a lot of these kind of commissioned academic research, it took a little while to actually appear. So it was delivered by a team at Middlesex University. Actually, 3 of the 4 members of the team have now left Middlesex University, but we did some of the work on responding to the peer review. So with these kind of projects, you produce a draft, it's then independently reviewed by assessors to make sure that you've done what you're supposed to have done, and to also kind of feedback on things. It's actually quite a good process because it sometimes identifies things that you think might be obvious, but which you actually might need to explain in a little bit more detail. So usually through peer review, you kind of refine a little bit to make the projects clearer.
And what was the aim of the project?
It's a bit of a mouthful, this one, because I think the title was An Investigation into Measures to Reduce Dog Attacks and to Promote Responsible Dog Ownership. And what it was actually about, it was about trying to identify methods to reduce dog attacks and to deal with dog control issues, as well as trying to provide the evidence or looking at some of the evidence to make recommendations that might promote responsible dog ownership and help dog owners who have dog control issues. So a key part of the project was about developing an in-depth understanding of some of the challenges faced by enforcers in dealing with dog control and dog attack issues. I suspect we're going to go on to talk about the legislation and the complicated nature of some of the legislation. And what we're trying to do in this kind of research is to identify how enforcement takes place and look at some of the risk factors relating to dog attacks. So that's kind of an overview of what we were trying to do.
And how did you do that? Was it through review of statistics and academic papers, or did you carry out any empirical research?
It was empirical research, but it was a combination. It was a kind of mixed methods approach. So the research was done following a tender by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and that specified that what they were looking for was qualitative research. Okay, so our approach was we did a literature review, quite a lengthy literature review, do what's called a rapid evidence assessment. So what you do is you identify, you get a sense of what the key themes are within the literature, and it's done as a way of kind of understanding what's within the literature in this particular area, but how it specifically relates to your research questions. We then did semi-structured interviews with law enforcement, police officers, local authority. We talked to some vets as well. And we also looked at a kind of range of evidence in order to try and get a sense of how the law is enforced, what the issues are, for people with dog control issues. And whilst we did do some statistical work on levels of dog attacks, it wasn't really a kind of public health or enforcement or quantitative analysis. It was a qualitative analysis, and by that I mean we're trying to understand in depth how enforcement works, what the perceptions are of those people trying to enforce the law. And you get from qualitative, you get probably more of a sense of what the reality of enforcement is and what the reality of the problems are that you don't get just from the quantitative data. So quantitative data, statistics gives you the numbers. Qualitative gives you a bit more about what are the actual problems people are facing. And that was quite deliberate.
And what do we mean by dog attacks? How are you using those terms, and terms, for example, in the report around dog bites and strikes?
Well, that was one of the early things that we identified. So one of our first empirical pieces of research was a roundtable discussion that involved a range of people involved in this issue. So police, local authority people, some people from NGOs, dog behavioural specialists and vets and so on. And almost the first thing we ended up discussing was the fact that the term dog attack is a little bit misleading, and that it's used as an umbrella term for all kinds of dog interactions. And also that the term dog attack applies an aggressive act on the dog's part, when in fact this isn't always the case.
Okay.
So we, as you've suggested in your question, so we essentially end up with three different terms: dog attacks, dog bites, and dog strikes. And the suggestion in this roundtable discussion was that the term dog attack should really only be used when you're describing a situation that involves multiple bites. The term dog strikes is more accurate to use a one-off contact situation, for example, where a dog jumps up onto a person or causes another animal to fall over. But a dog strike isn't necessarily aggressive either. So that's worth pointing out as well. And dog bite is probably speaks for itself. It's a situation where a dog actually bites somebody. But we tend to use the term dog attack to cover all of those scenarios, so that if a dog jumps up playfully on a person but is barking, that could be classed as a dog attack. But that's not necessarily an aggressive act. So it's quite important as we're going through the material to kind of say, look, we're looking at all types of things that might be classed as a dog attack, but in considering things like risk factors, which I suspect we'll talk about later on, and how you respond to them in an enforcement setting, it's important to distinguish between the different types of dog incident.
Yeah, and so why might a dog attack or strike if not because it's aggressive? What were the other factors that were identified in the report?
Yeah, well, when we looked at some of the literature surrounding this, and there have been various studies around dog behaviour. I'm a criminologist, not a veterinary specialist, so I found some of the material that I was looking at quite interesting, because both the academic literature and the information we got from our interviews indicated that the suggestion that all dog attack incidents are down to aggressive behaviour is a flawed assumption. So dogs can bite or strike for a variety of reasons, and they include play, because they want to defend or express themselves. Sometimes it's a response to fear, sometimes it's linked to predatory behaviour, sometimes it is aggression, but the assumption that it's always aggression is slightly flawed. So we're looking at a whole range of issues relating to how a dog will respond to the situation it's in, or in some cases is provoked in a situation, and we shouldn't assume that they're all aggressive. This is probably buried in a footnote in the report, but we do explain this in a bit of detail, that there are a whole load of different reasons why what we might perceive as a dog attack happens. Of course, some of them are down to aggressive behaviour, and we shouldn't discount that, but there are lots of different reasons. And in fact, one of the things we recommended in the report is better and more specific data collection, so that we have a clearer idea of what causes every incident, whether it's an attack, it's a bite, or it's a strike.
And I think the report identified there are situational factors, and there's also human behaviour that can be a risk factor for increasing the risk of a dog behaving in a way that might either be aggressive or cause it to become fearful or attack or strike for those reasons. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at again, both within the literature and in our empirical research, we looked at some material around the causes of dog attacks. And again, it's important to distinguish between attack, bite, and strike. And some of the studies, the previous studies that we examined in published research, noted that there are multiple reasons for dog bites. And as I've said, we identified that dog bites can be caused by a range of things, including fear, play, exploration, predatory behavior, response to past abuse, which I didn't mention just now, but should throw in, and perceived threat. And when we were looking at the risk factors, what we identified is that dog attacks, they don't have a homogeneous cause. And so you have to look at the extent to which they vary in severity, frequency, motivation, and situational risk factors. And from the evidence that we looked at, a range of situational factors can cause or make dog attacks more likely. This does include human behavior, particularly inappropriate behavior around dogs is a risk factor. And various of our research participants told us about scenarios where dogs have been provoked, and particularly issues around the socialization of dogs in the home and how they're dealt with in the home. But within the situational risk factors that we looked at, we included things like proximity between larger and smaller dogs in public places. And some of our veterinary colleagues talked about the fact that, you know, there is predatory behavior. And if you get large and small dogs together in a kind of conflict situation, then that potentially causes that's a risk factor, where you might look at it and go, okay, well, you might be able to address that by keeping those dogs apart. You also have children's interactions with dogs, and particularly poorly socialized dogs in the home. And then you can have trigger incidents in both public and private places, such as a dog experiencing fear or excitement, predatory behavior from other dogs, dogs being in unfamiliar settings, provocation by humans, and so on. So it actually points to a range of things where you need to look at, okay, what are the things that might make a dog behave in a way that could cause a dog attack, strike, or bite in a particular situation? What are the trigger incidents that might lead to that? And how is the dog being, I don't like the word controlled, but it's probably accurate. How is the dog being controlled or handled to minimize those risk scenarios? And something simple like having a dog on a lead, for example, might reduce the likelihood of a situation where you've got larger and smaller dogs in a kind of conflict situation. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but hopefully that identifies some of what we're looking at.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And what about lockdown? What did the report look at the effect of lockdown on this situation with dog attacks, strikes, and bites?
We did, yeah. I mean, it wasn't a particular focus of the research, but it's quite interesting. We started the research, I think, in 2019, and we had some fieldwork planned just as lockdown was taking place, and we had to sort of temporarily suspend some of the work that we were doing. And I freely confess, I thought, oh, this is a disaster, that we're not going to be able to collect data from police forces, and we're not going to be able to do something. And there were some things that we couldn't do. We obviously couldn't hold face-to-face focus groups with dog owners, which is something that we were hoping to do. However, the flip side of that is that what it did mean is that we were being able to do virtual interviews with police and local authority staff who've been dealing with dog control issues with lockdown. And a number of our enforcement participants said that they'd actually seen an increase in incidents during the lockdown period, which was quite interesting because the reasons for this included things like people being around their dogs for longer, family members who were not used to dealing with dogs having increased interaction with the dogs, failure to control dogs when they're out in public places, and perhaps after having been cooped up for longer than usual, dogs were being taken out, were more excited, and that's when some goes back to what I was saying earlier on about some incidents being a result of incitement rather than aggression. Now, given that we didn't address this issue on a national level, we have to be a bit cautious about trying to draw any blanket conclusion from it. However, certainly for some of the enforcement participants we spoke to, both police and local authority, what lockdown illustrated is the extent to which the human factor in proximity to dogs and poor control or socialization of dogs, and how dogs were dealt with when they were eventually let out, was a factor, and perhaps highlighted the need for kind of awareness of risk factors when dogs are going out in public, and when dogs are around people who are not used to being around dogs.
Yeah. And what about the contribution to risk from breed? Is that something that the report looked at?
We didn't really look at that in too much detail because the project wasn't specifically about breed. It was about, if you like, the kind of characteristics and causes. And many of our research participants, for example, pointed out that they'd owned dangerous breeds without ever having any difficulty. Again, in their minds, reinforcing the idea that it's how you handle the dog rather than just what breed the dog is. And certainly, when we looked at some of the literature, it is quite interesting that the literature it's probably best to say it's inconclusive on the subject of breed as a kind of causal risk factor. And it's quite important to note that that's separate from the discussion of severity of injury, because there's certainly some literature that says that some of the breeds classed as dangerous, where they attack, it's more severe. But that's slightly different from saying their breed itself causes the attack. So it wasn't something that we looked at in a great deal of detail, and we didn't see, the evidence that was presented to us by our research participants wasn't specifically about breed. It was about, these are the scenarios that would potentially cause a problem with any dog. So that, for example, people would talk about small dogs, Jack Russells, German Shepherds, etc., as being involved in dog attacks, rather than just what you might class as a particular type of breed that you might expect. So it's not discounting breed, but it's saying, well, actually, in the evidence that we looked at, the evidence was that either dogs are not inherently dangerous, but there are problems when they are poorly socialized and not properly controlled, or almost the opposite view, but which has the same effect. All dogs are dangerous unless they are, properly socialized and engaged with appropriate behaviors. So it's about the behavioral characteristics and the situational risk factors and triggers rather than specifically about breed.
I think it's really important when we're talking about legislation around dog control that there is this knowledge base to draw upon. And I agree with you that there is a real gap in terms of risk analysis. That's why one of the reasons why I was so pleased to see this report come out. What did you find about the current legal tools available to enforcers to address dogs that were exhibiting behaviour that we might consider dangerous? What's already out there?
Well, there are several tools that can be used and are being used. And to be honest, we could probably do a half-hour podcast just on discussing the law in detail. So if you want me to come back and do that, I'll happily do that, because I can bore on this subject for a good hour. But we tend to talk, for example, about the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991 as being one of the tools, but also there are measures in the 1871 Dogs Act that some authorities still told us that they still use. And this allows for an order to be imposed by a court that includes measures to keep a dog under control. Dangerous Dogs Act 1991, which has been amended by the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, is there, which also provides for measures to be taken to require people to control their dogs, to deal with dogs that are dangerously out of control. And we probably also shouldn't forget broader legislation like the Animal Welfare Act 2006, which also imposes an obligation on people who are owners or responsible persons in respect of completely forgot what I was about to say. Companion animals, protected animals under the law, which includes dogs. And there's a duty to ensure appropriate standards of animal welfare. That includes an obligation in respect of allowing your companion animal to exhibit normal and healthy behaviours, to be properly fed, have an appropriate diet, appropriate stimulation, to avoid unnecessary suffering, and so on. And I have now blanked on the legislation that relates to attacks on livestock.
There is
but I know that's in the appendix. Yeah, it's a 1950s act, and I've completely forgotten what the name of the law is.
And I think it's being
It's
being updated, isn't it? I think through the Kept Animals Bill, there are going to be new provisions for livestock worrying. So it's obviously an area that policymakers are concerned about. So
yeah, and we did a very quick piece of research almost as an addendum to the main research. We were asked to look at livestock, and it's in one of the appendices to the report, where we did a quick analysis of what the legislation is, some of the prosecutions that have taken place, and there was some work directed by the National Police Chiefs Council, where they had, I think, 5 police forces look at livestock issues. Because I think anecdotally we know that there are issues with dogs attacking livestock, but it's one of those things that's perhaps a little bit to the side of the main issues when we talk about dog attacks and dog bites and dog strikes. But certainly we looked at some of the evidence for that. And essentially, a kind of overview of the legal tools is that there are measures that basically allow action to be taken where a dog is out of control and where a dog is dangerous. Now, one of the questions that the research looked at is, how are those powers being enforced? And perhaps the distinction between the kind of preventative mechanisms that are being used under various pieces of legislation, things like community protection notices and the dog control notices in Scotland, and perhaps the more punitive approaches which might deal with an issue after something has happened. And as a criminologist, even though this is not necessarily put in the report, I would say that I look at all sorts of areas where offences take place, and it's kind of a big part of my work. And sometimes we have a binary approach where it's either punitive, or it's preventative, or it's rehabilitative. And in part, what I think about when I'm looking at how you can improve enforcement of things is how you can bring those 3 things together.
Yes, because I think what people sometimes don't realise is the penalties under the Dangerous Dogs Act are actually quite harsh. They've got quite tough prison sentences for obviously the most serious of offences, and that presumably is so that there is a deterrent effect. But actually, you've got to look at those other factors that contribute to risk and looking at how the legislative framework can reduce or support the reduction of risk through other measures. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your definition of harsh, I should say, because I mean, if you fail to control your dog and it then results in a fatality, I suspect some people would say, well, actually, in that sense, why would it be different from any other incident where somebody has been killed? I stress, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's a perspective that some people would have. But yeah, I mean, as a critical criminologist, I spend a lot of my time evaluating what legislation actually achieves, and sometimes that's different from what it's intended to achieve. So on the face of it, some legislation is intended to be punitive and to deal with a problem after an offence has occurred, while other legislation might be intended to be preventative. And it's often in the application of the legislation that you look at whether or not it has a disincentive or a deterrent effect. And certainly within criminology, we talk a lot about the fact that actually for something to be a deterrent, it's not just the fact that a penalty is there, but it's the knowledge of the penalty, the knowledge of the likely application of the penalty. That's what deterrence theory, broadly speaking, would say. That's where you get the deterrent. If people understand that if something happens, not only could they face this penalty, but they are likely to face this penalty, and the evidence is that the penalty is rigorously and routinely applied. Now, you could contest that by saying, well, most people know that if they commit a murder, they're going to go to prison, and yet we haven't eradicated murder.
Mm.
So in that sense, again, I could probably do another half-hour podcast on that if you want to ask me back. I'll talk about deterrence theory. But that's problematic, because you look at things like that, and the one that people frequently trot out is the use of the death penalty in places like America. If deterrent worked in its purest sense, you wouldn't, the death penalty would be considered to be effective. Because in some states they will still execute people, but it's way more complicated than that. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think, the application of legislation in some cases is about a disincentive, but it's also about preventative action. So if you look at things like the community protection notice, and that orders the person responsible for the dog, and it's usually the dog owner, to stop or control the problematic behavior. And if that's appropriately applied, then arguably that does work as a disincentive and a deterrent. Likewise, the orders that can be put in place under the 1871 Dogs Act are intended to control the aberrant behaviour and prevent a reoccurrence. And I think the same intention is for Scotland's dog control notices have the same intention as well. It's about preventative action that also is a disincentive towards allowing dogs to get out of control.
Yes, I suppose by harsh I was meaning really tough.
I knew what you meant. No, I knew what you meant, because I think sometimes, when you think about a kind of dog attack or a dog bite, and if you specifically think about dog bite, you might think, oh, for somebody to go to prison for a dog bite is arguably an overreaction. But when you are talking about a dog that's dangerously out of control and then results in fatality, I mean, if you're a farmer and a large part of your livestock has been wiped out by a dog attack, you may feel, you'd be perfectly justified in feeling this requires a serious, what's the difference between a dog attacking and killing my livestock and somebody coming along and shooting it? At the end of the day, I have still experienced the loss, and the sheep have been killed, or whatever other livestock it is. Yeah.
But I think if we accept we've reached the point where it's not about increasing the penalties to further deter behaviour, but actually trying to address risk. I thought one of the interesting recommendations from the report was compulsory behaviour training after an incident that might actually provide an enforcement tool to actually reduce risk where a bite has happened. Perhaps a dog doesn't have characteristic or tendencies for aggressive behaviour, but maybe it's something about either the socialisation or the interaction with the dog. That seemed to me really interesting.
I mean, it's something that we've kind of picked up on in certainly some of our because we reported anonymously, we didn't identify particular individuals, but certainly we're aware that there are already some kind of pilots of this kind of thing going on, where the idea is that what you're trying to do is to improve the socialization of the dog and the interaction of the dog and the owner. And in fact, it's something that our Dutch colleagues suggested that they already operate something along these lines. And again, that is in the report, but I suspect most people probably didn't pick up. That's part of what happens. And it's about the idea that, well, at its most basic level, I think if you have a problem with a dog that's aggressive or exhibits problematic behaviors, and the owner is unaware of how to deal with that, then the potential problem is, even if action is taken in relation to that individual dog, if the owner then just goes away and gets another dog, you potentially have a repeat of the scenario. And it's why, again, I think elsewhere in some of our animal protection legislation, we have banning orders that prevent people from continuing to own animals after they've committed an offence. But here, it's about saying, okay, I don't personally. The analogy with speed awareness training is a bit of a crude one, but it's actually an accurate one. Because what you're trying to do is to say to somebody who's been caught speeding multiple times, well, actually, you need to modify your behaviour. So you've got the option of taking their licence away from them, but if you suspend them from driving for say 6 months or so, and then they just come back and just do it again, have you solved the problem? Whereas if you send them on a speed awareness course, hopefully you have action that kind of modifies their behaviour. And I do quite a lot of work around sort of corporate environmental crime, and one of the things that we're quite keen on in that arena is, how do you change the behaviour so that it doesn't just keep happening over and over and over again? Well, that principle, the principle of the speed awareness training and the principle of the behavioural training here, is to try and modify the behaviour and to add to that both understanding of why the problem occurred in the first place, but also to then kind of prevent a recurrence of the problem and about changing the behaviour. And what our Dutch colleagues informed us is that they do that with both the owner and the dog.
Right.
So that it's an understanding of the way your individual dog behaves and an understanding of what to do in order to address any problematic behaviours. Now, arguably, the Animal Welfare Act 2006 already requires you to understand how your individual dog behaves, because otherwise, how do you know what are normal behaviours for that particular dog? And that's a requirement within that legislation. But here, if it follows from a dog attack incident, you're addressing the causes of the incident, and you're looking at how to prevent a recurrence and how to address those problems.
And I know you say you didn't look specifically at breed, but does the report in any way feed into the debate about breed-specific legislation?
That's probably, I mean, this is going to be a yes and no answer, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, because it wasn't specifically about it wasn't about breed-specific legislation. And I know the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee suggested that there was a need for a review of legislation. And we have made it clear that that's not what this report was about. So it's probably for other people to discuss breed-specific legislation, given that it wasn't part of our remit to look at it. And we didn't look at it specifically. But I can see where the project could feed into this, that kind of discussion, because, for example, one of the things we do highlight is the variation in the legislation that's used by enforcers. So some are using the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991 as their default. Others are using the 1871 Dogs Act because they think it's more effective in what they're trying to do. And we do actually make a recommendation for further research on prosecution practices and local enforcement policies. So whilst that's not about breed-specific legislation, it is about how people use the legislation that's available to them and what choices they've made. In some cases, some people are using the 1871 Act because it's what they were trained on when they started the job. In other cases, it's a local policy. It's, so that's where I think we do make a specific recommendation about looking at enforcement practice and looking at prosecution policies as well.
Yeah.
But it's not specifically about breed-specific legislation.
So what were the main conclusions coming out of the report, or the main recommendations for improvement in legislation or improvement in enforcement?
Well, actually, I mean, in terms of legislation, I think, although there isn't an explicit recommendation that says this, I think one way to read our conclusions is that there actually isn't necessarily anything wrong with the enforcement legislation itself. but it's how it's applied. And then we found a variation in the enforcement response. So that our police and local authority participants identified that the priority given to dog attack issues and the recording of these varied. So it varied sometimes according to local policy decisions, sometimes according to the knowledge of the people doing the job. We also identified that collaboration between the police and local authorities was varied, and there's no criticism implied of any individuals for that. It's kind of how local arrangements have emerged, and this notion of an inconsistent approach being used in relation to enforcement powers, where at least one of our local authority participants just said, we never prosecute. Now, I'm sure they don't mean it probably as bluntly as that, but they said they had never prosecuted for dog attack issues, and it was very hard to get a prosecution going in their particular area. So with that variation in approach, one of the recommendations we made is that there should be a statutory duty for local authorities with clear guidance on their responsibilities, the available powers and best practice in enforcement. There was a guide to enforcement published by DEFRA, I think 2014, I'd have to go back and check that. But that perhaps needs to be linked to a kind of statutory enforcement notion, because at the moment it appears that it's down to discretion, and it varies with some enforcement. Some local authorities essentially saying, well, broadly we just pick up and deal with stray dogs. We leave everything else to the police. Whereas others saying, well, actually, no, we work really, really, there are some great examples of police and local authorities working very closely together, perceiving dog attacks as a sort of antisocial behaviour problem and a public health problem, and dealing with it very rigorously. But like a lot of other areas, I guess, where it's not a kind of statutory duty for the local authorities, it's going to be it's going to vary. It's going to depend on local resources, policies, etc. So that's something that we identified, although we noted that would have resource implications. And then the core investigation of the research is probably into the use of how new powers are being used. And some, again, participants identified the need to consider the use of what they consider to be more effective powers. So whereas the perception might be that something like community protection notices are a strong enforcement tool, some of our participants were saying, well, actually, we don't use those because we don't consider them to be particularly effective. But equally, there are others saying, well, actually, we do use them, and we impose all sorts of conditions linked to them. So we're telling people that the dog has to be on a lead, or has to be muzzled, or shouldn't be walked by anybody under 18 years old, so that we set in place the notion that whoever is control of the dog is capable of controlling the dog. So that's kind of the broad recommendations in relation to the sort of enforcement side of it. And it's about, we've also recommended that we, as I think I've alluded to earlier, that we need to think about how we record the details of dog attacks, bites and strikes, so that we have reliable data on what actually happened and what caused it.
And aligned to those areas, obviously, we don't want people to be acting outside the law in the first place. So what potential role of education here? Did the report consider any delivery projects that might actually help with that side?
We talk a little bit about education, and I think one of the recommendations is around people having compulsory knowledge. Now, how you achieve that is potentially problematic, because in terms of the material that's available, there's a lot of really good stuff that already exists. And one of the challenges is, if you have organisations like the Kennel Club and the Dogs Trust and others who are providing information on responsible dog ownership, but people are not accessing that information, and then that's an issue. So you could go for, compulsory education was discussed, in particular our first research roundtable with a range of participants.
Mm.
But I have to say that given some of the challenges in getting other things into the compulsory curriculum,
Yes.
it's difficult to see that will happen anytime soon. Likewise, the availability of affordable training is something that's also desirable.
Yeah.
But again, there are likely sound market reasons why training costs what it does. You are, after all, going to an expert and asking that expert to provide you with in kind of guidance and training. I mean, this is something that probably requires further research, I think, because increased education can never be a bad thing. But actually, when we started to look at the education and the material that was available, there's actually quite a lot out there. And I think this is partly why we thought we need to address the problem of why people are not accessing the resources that are available to them. Yeah. And this is where potentially that compulsory knowledge before you get a dog is something that perhaps need to be looked at. And that is not without its problems. So.
Well, this is a really difficult area and it's multi-layered, as you've alluded to. And I think the report's really great and would recommend it to anyone who's a stakeholder in this area or simply just interested in these dog-related issues. So thank you very much, Angus, for sharing your knowledge with us today and talking us through the report. It's been really interesting.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, and have a good rest of the day. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. And if you give us a good review, it will help others to find us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss a show.
Talking Animal Law is sponsored by Goldsmith Chambers Animal Rights Team at www.goldsmithchambers.com. This project has been supported by funding from Animal Charity Evaluators Movement grants. For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's iroarpod.com.